now we're turning to two of, I think, our most distinguished and thoughtful external commentators on national security, who can give us a perspective from a non-governmental consumer perspective, but also, I think, with a lot of experience in government, particularly in the case of our first speaker, Peter Ricketts, Lord Peter Ricketts, who, of course, almost everybody here, I think, will know very well, a long and distinguished career in the diplomatic service, ending up as the head of our diplomatic service and the first national security advisor, who, of course, looks with great interest as to how that initiative has developed over the years. And he's also, since he left government, been the author of a book, Hard Choices, What Britain Does Next. And as part of that book, he concludes that the art of strategic thinking has been lost in Western governments during a long period of strategic stability since 1945, and suggests perhaps that in the period we now are entering, that need for greater strategic thinking is more evident than ever. So the procedure is Peter will talk for a few minutes. I may ask some questions of my own, but I'm relying on the audience, as in the last session, to come in with further questions. As I understand it, as I've just been told, the questions that you have already put for the previous session are about to be wiped from the slate. I think they're being wiped at this very moment. So if there are questions which you did want to ask in the last session and weren't asked for reasons of time, and you do feel they're relevant for our next speaker, then please do re-ask them, since they have now all vanished from my Q&A box. So without any further ado, over to you, Peter, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Malcolm, and great to be joining you. I do agree this is a very, very important issue, and I think that skills training for the national security community can be better done than we've done them in the past, and I very much welcome the chance to reflect on that. So I'm going to focus on my own experience of the practice of national security and how it's developed, and, as you say, one or two of the gaps that I think have been shown up. The substance of what constitutes national security, of course, changes over time as threats and risks come and go, as Michael Gove was explaining. It also varies between countries, depending on a lot of different factors. But making national security policy, I think, is reasonably constant through this changing landscape. And I mean, so there's no secret in my talk, I essentially agree with the sort of words that the government have been using over recent years, words like fusion and integration, because I think the practice of national security is essentially blending together different disciplines to create synergies and more powerful policies. And although the name national security was new to Whitehall when we set up the National Security Council in 2010, on David Cameron's first day as Prime Minister, of course, the practice of government departments working together on security and defence has been going on for a very long time. In the Cold War, national security was essentially seen as being the hardest end of the spectrum, military security against the threat from the Soviet Union. And that was very much the preserve of the armed forces, the MOD, the Foreign Office, the intelligence community, with a small staff in the Cabinet Office. And I joined the very small cadre of Foreign Office practitioners of national security when I was posted to the delegation to NATO in 1978, in the middle of the Cold War. And at that time in the Foreign Office, you would find a small cadre of people who had specialized in security and defense, essentially nuclear policy and strategy, that arcane science, and arms control and disarmament. The other aspect of national security in Cold War Whitehall was the IRA threat, which of course was very significant through much of the late Cold War. And that was also dealt with by a very small cadre, essentially the Northern Ireland office, the Security Service, and the Home Office, who were a very closed community, again with a small coordinating secretariat in the Cabinet Office. And I want to emphasize at this point just how siloed Whitehall was in those days, even well into the post-Cold War period. Not just that the external facing parts of Whitehall, the Foreign Office, the MOD, rarely, if ever, had business to do with the Home Office, but also the intelligence agencies were very, very separate. Separate cultures, separate styles, separate IT networks. They reported, of course, to different ministers, Security Service to the Home Secretary, and GCHQ and MI6 to the Foreign Secretary, had very little to do with each other. I think two developments shifted that in Whitehall. One was that period of wars of intervention. The initial interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo found Whitehall really woefully prepared to deal with post-conflict stabilization work. There was no sort of database of experts on administration, elections, police training, all the skills that we suddenly needed, first in Bosnia and then in Kosovo. And DFID, which was only created in 1997, was scrambling to develop some expertise in that area. That was shown up very significantly in Iraq, of course. By the time of Afghanistan, there had been a real sea change. I have vivid memories of visiting Helmand province, going to the provincial reconstruction teams and finding young lieutenant colonels very eloquent about the development requirements in Afghanistan, and equally DFID professionals living and working alongside the military and absolutely having integrated into that hard security world. One of them, indeed, Lindy Cameron, has now taken over the National Cybersecurity Centre. So seeing DFID and the MOD working very effectively together was one sign of what I would call national security practice, working across boundaries that had up to then been pretty absolute. The other factor that broke down the silos was, of course, the terrorist attacks, first of all 9/11, and then the 7/7 attacks on the London transport network, which showed that we had a homegrown Islamist terrorist problem in the UK. That brought the intelligence agencies together very rapidly. We started to see joint teams between the agencies working on the same target, Security Service from the domestic side, MI6 from the international side. And that was revolutionary at the time. Also, it brought people who knew about the external security imperatives like me in touch with the Home Office, counterterrorism people, and all of us in touch with local government, experts on community cohesion as we develop the contest and prevent strategies, which are national security strategies par excellence because they reach right across the domains of domestic and international policy. So by the time 2010 came, there was already a cadre of people in Whitehall who had worked with other departments, who'd served with them, who'd become expert in the cultures and practices of different departments and agencies. But the structures at the centre of Whitehall hadn't kept up. And that, I think, was one of the motives for the new Conservative government creating the NSC and the position of National Security Advisor, which I was lucky to be given. There were other factors as well, like the continuing expansion of the universe of national security. Cyber was very much coming up as a major issue by then. So was resilience, as Michael Gove was saying. Resilience and cyber threats, of course, both involving private sector as well as public sector, and also involving local government and other actors beyond central government. David Cameron also wanted a more systematic approach to decision-taking in the national security area, having been very critical of what he called the Tony Blair sofa government approach, the very informal approach to decision-making, which I think was indeed the case during the run-up to Iraq. So the NSC did bring ministers from all the different disciplines around Whitehall together in one regular cabinet-level meeting, and also with the right advisors around the table, not just the Chief of Defence Staff, Chairman of the JIC, giving the Joint Intelligence Committee for the first time access to ministerial clients to be able to see how their products were landing, whether they were relevant, and the heads of the intelligence agencies as well. I think that's one of the other really important developments under the NSC banner. It brought intelligence agency practice into much closer association with policymaking. Not having intelligence agency heads advise on policy, that is a red line still, but having them at the table so they could give their advice direct and they could see what was shaping policymaking. I think it's very important in bringing the intelligence community out of the shadows and into the mainstream national security policymaking. It produced a group of ministers who had become, after a year or two, pretty expert across the board of the different issues that make up the national security portfolio. I also created an NSC officials meeting, which was the PermSec level of all those represented on the NSC, which again was partly to encourage this sense of synergy and working together across Whitehall. I also hoped it would be a place where we could do more strategic thinking, because I had observed that increasingly for ministers in a democracy, it was almost impossible to carve out the time for longer term thinking when crisis management was so compelling, where all the pressures of media and social media and parliament, everything else was piling on them to shorten all the time the tempo of political decision making and crowding out the time for the important but perhaps less immediate. I think that partly succeeded. I think permanent secretaries enjoyed being able to get their hands on strategy as opposed to resources and running their departments. But I do believe, as Malcolm said, and as I try to explain in my book, that somewhere along the line, since the post-war period, when Britain and other countries really did have to think in big picture strategic terms about the shape of the future peace, we haven't had to do that really. We've had the umbrella of American protective security. We've been in a relatively settled strategic landscape. Now we're emerging from that. And I think we do need to get better at thinking about the longer term, bigger picture stuff, and anything that can be done to reinforce training and preparation for that, to my mind, is a very good idea. One more word about the National Security Council, and then just very briefly about skills. I think some departments, when we set up the NSC, saw it as a threat, saw it as tanks on their lawn, if I can put it like that, crowding them out. Actually, it was never that. And the National Security Secretariat we set up, deliberately composed of people from all around the various governments and agencies, and government departments and agencies involved. It was always small. It was never capable of initiating a lot of policy on its own, but it was often the only place in Whitehall where you could draw together all the strands of a policy, knit them together and prepare one overall coherent approach, which in my mind is the essence of national security. I was interested to hear Pamela talking about the skills agenda and the idea of a national security college. And I do think that there is a lot to be done in that area. If you accept my definition of what the practice of national security is, then I think it follows that the most important things is that early in people's careers, they get the chance to work with, come to know those from other departments and agencies with different cultures, different backgrounds, different ways of thinking about the world and policy making, and get comfortable with them. In my generation, that was done really on the job by the happenstance of postings. Those who had a particular opportunity to work with the MOD often then came back to that policy area in the future. I think making it much more systematic for those who want to pursue a career in and around security, foreign policy and defense would make a lot of sense, of course, involving the Home Office and the intelligence agencies as well. Whether that should be in the form of sort of long staff college type courses, I'm less sure, because although the military are good at planning that into people's careers, the civilian departments never have been. And we have a very bad track record of promising to send people on long courses and then pulling them off the course when the next crisis happens. But if we could think of it being modular, immersive, intense short-term courses for a cohort of people who would become familiar with each other's cultures and ways of working, I think that could be really important. I think I'm inclined to leave it to Lawrence Freedman to say whether he thinks you can teach good strategy. But I think courses like that could at least raise awareness of people on the importance of evidence-led, numerically literate, systematic thinking, not just about what's in front of your nose, but about what might be coming in 1 year or 10 years' time. And that, I think, would be very helpful in a period of really disruptive change that we're facing now. So, Malcolm, that's my kickoff of how national security policy making has felt to me and how it's evolved in the last decade or two. And very, very happy to discuss any aspect of it.
Peter, that's very helpful indeed. And I think it's particularly useful for this conference that you set where we are in that historic context, because I would entirely endorse what you said in relation to how siloed Whitehall was 30 years ago and how that's developed, but how I think there's still a long way to go. But maybe I could start by just asking you to reflect a little bit on the outer boundaries of the national security community in Whitehall, because I think for very good reasons the boundaries have expanded and there's been more integration between more joined up thinking and action between those organizations which we typically think of as national security, whether that's the intelligence services, defense, large parts of the Foreign Office and so on. But increasingly the integrated review certainly does this. Areas of policy which we might not have thought of as national security in the past are now being talked about in those terms, by some at least. So our policy towards the threat that climate change poses, the response to global health emergencies, such as the one we're going through, issues even of investment policy or trade policy are very important in terms of how we deal with China, BRI, development aid, and so on. And isn't there a risk that when we're talking about national security strategy, we're actually talking about national strategy in general, encompassing everything that the government does, or almost everything? So I'd be interested in this, but yet we have a national security advisor who in principle is supposed to be in charge of implementing the IR, but actually is focusing more, I think, he's the Prime Minister's chief foreign policy advisor after all. He's focusing more on what I would say the traditional national security departments, and probably less on some of those other aspects which feel as if they're still sitting in somewhere else in the Cabinet Office. So talk me through that, because I think it's relevant to the skills agenda. Are we really saying that, I can see that almost every government department, there's a fusion aspect to what they do. There are others in other departments who they have to work with to do their job effectively, but they don't have to work with every other department. There are some which are more important than others, and it may vary a lot depending on their particular responsibilities. In a way, I'm posing a conundrum without an answer, but I'd be really interested, particularly in your views as to where the outer boundaries of the national security community are at the moment in government.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. I mean, I'm tempted to say it's a bit like the universe. I think it's constantly expanding and there seems to be no outer limit at all, which I think has risks, actually. Of course, there's no copyright on the term national security. I mean, a government can slap that label on any policy it chooses. In the beginning, you know, the word security tended to mean military security, security of the state against existential threats. I talked about the Cold War. I think after the Cold War, national security increasingly took on the component of human security, the importance of human rights, of quality of the life, of the environment, of climate, the economic aspects, developmental aspects as well. And of course, they are all relevant to people's security. And in principle, almost anything can be yoked into national security. As you say already, I think our list of national security issues has grown to include issues like the climate, now very much public health cooperation between countries, resilience of critical national infrastructure, grids and so forth, the environment, all sorts of things which would not have been dreamt of, I think, when the US Congress passed the National Security Act in 1947. I see two risks, really. One is a risk of false assurance, because there is some attraction to governments, I'm not particularly talking about the British government, in saying, calling something a national security issue to reassure the public, don't worry, you know, we've got our most highly prized assets on this case, we're looking after you. Where maybe they're not, maybe there is no actual contribution that the national security community can make to keeping people safe. The second is dispersion. Too many priorities and therefore no priorities. Yeah. And I myself believe that that was a bit of an issue with the integrated review. Extremely well-written document full of very interesting, ambitious ideas, but no sense of prioritization at all. No sense that Britain's resources are finite. And the more you add to the list of issues that are to be dealt with by the national security community, in an expanded sense, the more the risk that attention will be dispersed, resources will be dispersed, and that the really critical issues may be missed. I mean, I think you could make that criticism of my generation of national security practitioners in the sense that we made a pandemic threat one of the top 4 national security priorities in 2010, and again in 2015, and yet Whitehall was caught unprepared for the scale and nature of the pandemic that hit us. So we do have a lot to learn about resilience planning. I mean, I think, to my mind, unless there is something that the national security community, that is the part of Whitehall that deals with classified material, with the hard end as well as the soft end of power, can contribute to an issue, there's not a lot of point in classifying it as national security and putting it on the agenda of the National Security Council, because otherwise you quite quickly land up, as you say, with the entire government's program, in which case you might as well just have the cabinet and, you know, do away with a subcategory of issues called national security. So I would try to keep it within some bounds, and even within those bounds, I would try and set priorities. I think actually it was right to do a prioritized list of risks in 2010, and I rather regret that there is no sense of prioritization in the 2021 document.
I think that's very helpful indeed, and I think the real sense of prioritization for the government over the next 3 years, of course, will come in the spending review.
Right.
See then,
right.
What the real priorities are, because there will
exactly.
be finite resources. We've of course we've got that in relation to the defence budget, but we haven't got it in relation to any other of the big.
Well, we've got it in relation to the development budget as well, and I think the decisions on the defence and development budgets actually were, the French would say, structuring of the national security environment for the next 5 years.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, unless the government reverses itself, since they have said the spending commitment is the reduction in aid spending is related to fiscal circumstances, but we shall see how that turns out this summer. So maybe another question for me before then going to those which are piling up. And you talked about the balance between departmental training and centralized training. And maybe if there's something you can say, given your background, about how you think the experience with the diplomatic academy has gone, and whether, from your perspective, how much that training at the departmental level now in the FCDO, but I'm speaking from your experience of the FCO, what the gaps in that are, which could be filled by a national security college.
Well, I have to first of all make a confession, which I'm sure will shock everyone on the call. I don't think I hardly ever did a training course of any kind in my career. I vaguely remember that there was a 2-week induction course for new entrants in 1974. And beyond that, I really didn't do any at all. I mean, it was almost all on-the-job training.
Right.
And you may say, well, then, you know, that explains a lot. But I think that was the case. Of course, Whitehall has got a lot better since then. And indeed, the FCO, before I left, was a lot more systematic, mainly in the functional training area. which is very important indeed. Specialisms, economics training, trainings on the human rights agenda, international law, issues like that. I think the academy is an excellent idea in the FCDO, and I know that it is essentially a virtual academy. And of course now, given the tools like Zoom, which will no doubt continue to be used after the pandemic is over, you can do a great deal without necessarily bringing people together in classrooms for weeks on end of immersive training. So I think that that's a good thing to do. I think they're also reaching out to previous practitioners, to academics, to commentators, to journalists, to NGO professionals, to bring in wider expertise to help staff with constant learning through their careers, all of which I think is an excellent thing. But I'd go back to the point I made in my opening thoughts, that I have found that the civilian departments find it really difficult to release people for more than an occasional week or so, because the military, training, exercising, preparing is absolutely a core part of their function. Indeed, since they're not fighting wars most of the time, quite a lot of a military career is spent in preparing and planning and developing yourself for the moment when that becomes absolutely critical to the country. Whereas civilian departments and agencies and local government are completely stretched all the time in dealing with the day job, don't have the manpower margin, and find it very difficult to create it in order to do longer term training. So I think, and I really think in the case of national security, the crucial thing is breaking down the barriers, which are already lower than they used to be, at the early stages of people's careers, so that they get comfortable and accustomed to working with those from other parts of Whitehall. I very rarely worked with anyone from the more domestically economic-facing departments in Whitehall until very late in my career. Equally, I didn't really deal with the Home Office until the terrorist crises of the 2000 and the years after that. And I think that must be improved in the future. The last thing I'd say, and I know Whitehall is much better at this now as well, is mobility, giving people the chance to go and spend 3 years in a line job in another department or agency, so that you pick up the culture of that, and indeed out into the private sector and bringing more private sector people in with different backgrounds into the civil service. That is enormously important in expanding people's horizons, and it needs to be valued in the appraisal systems of individual departments. Again, I speak from rather out-of-date knowledge, but I don't think Whitehall departments were good at valuing the expertise gained outside Whitehall in their appraisal processes. I hope it's better now, but that's also a crucial enabler for this mobility, which I think is a very important part of developing broadly based civil servants of the future.
Very good, and I think that's very much in line with what Pamela was saying earlier in terms of the importance of those early stages of people's careers. Right, let's go to the questions from the audience. The first one I have is from Yvonne Walsham, who asks, how do you develop strategic skills for politicians rising through the ranks towards ministerial responsibilities so that they are better prepared on taking office? I mean, I'm always so impressed by the way in which politicians take on a brief, and within a couple of days they're standing in front of the House of Commons or talking to ministers from other countries and expected to know about a subject on which often they have had very little preparation beforehand. So, but it's important for our country that they are, and of course our officials do a really good job in briefing ministers as thoroughly as they can. But is there more we can do?
Well, yes, I think there is more we can do. I think it's an extremely good question, because the British parliamentary system par excellence has a natural selection process, I think, which favours those who, as you say, are brilliant at picking up a subject quickly, at presenting it fluently and eloquently, and brilliant tactical manoeuvre at parliamentary tactics. All of these are vital skills, and you see when British ministers are in international meetings, they often dominate because of their fluency, because of their ability to speak ad lib without a script, and adapt tactically to the situation. But they move around very quickly often, and that fluency and spontaneity that they have often masks very, very shallow depth of knowledge about the subjects they're dealing with. And also the whole parliamentary environment adds to the short-termist pressures of dealing with the urgent and immediate rather than the important longer-term issues. And many of our ministers come into their jobs having pretty largely spent their careers in politics. This isn't a criticism, but it's an observation, often starting in party structures, moving in to be an MP, perhaps in local government, and then a minister, without ever having much experience outside that, and often not in jobs which required them to think strategically. I think if you're a CEO of a major company, you do have to think not just about next quarter's results, but also the investments you're making, which will need to make returns over the next 10, 20, 30 years in some cases. And so I think some of the big private sector jobs really do develop the skills of thinking in a very systematic, data-based way about future risks and opportunities. And I think that ministers could very usefully have those skills as well. What is the solution? Well, one is called the Institute for Government, which I think is a great innovation over the last decade. And I would encourage particularly opposition parliamentarians who have aspirations for high office or junior MPs, before they take on these massive jobs at the top of the career, to get some of these skills, to do some thinking while they have the capacity, build up the strategic bank of knowledge and experience of the techniques while they can, because you don't have time to do it. Once you get appointed to be Foreign Secretary, there's no more time for learning strategic skills. You have to be operational from the first minute. So I think invest early also for politicians in developing strategic skills, which parliamentary success doesn't necessarily call on.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And your description of politicians, I mean, generic description, sounded very much like barristers, the best barristers who can pick up a brief very well and take up whatever brief they're given. But ministers are not only there to present policy, they're there to develop it, which requires it.
They are. I mean, I might just, if two more sentences. I mean, some of the modern politicians I've worked with who are best at strategic thinking aren't actually holding down the sort of parliamentary jobs that makes it so difficult, I think, in the UK. One was Barack Obama, who was very professorial and thoughtful in his approach to things. Of course, as president, he wasn't quite in the minute-by-minute battle that British prime ministers are. The other is Emmanuel Macron, who isn't a professional politician, has had experience in other areas, and is also very much capable of standing back and thinking in more strategic terms. So I think there are people who are not in that parliamentary maelstrom, even if they're in very, very senior, heavily weighted jobs, who have been able to bring strategic skills with them. So I think our challenge is to graft those skills onto very successful parliamentary careers as well.
No, indeed, I think that's absolutely right. And of course, we are also unusual amongst major powers in having all our senior ministers also being responsible for constituencies.
Indeed.
Which is the long-term job of a member of parliament, the primary job in many regards, and quite rightly so. And suddenly people are being given all these extra responsibilities. So that's an extra burden, I think.
It is.
Which people are not always aware of in other countries. Right, let's turn to something else. Gary Hearn asks, the availability of modular attendance within longer military professional education is an option, collaborative, pan-government. The trick being to identify those parts that are relevant and practical. I'm not sure what the question here. I mean, maybe it talks to what you're saying. I mean, my experience of the Defence Academy is that there are a significant number of people from other government departments which attend those courses. So although you're absolutely right, Peter, that it's difficult to allow people some time out, there are opportunities for doing that. And maybe how much of a priority, I mean, in a sense, I think in your remarks, you were almost saying, well, we're never going to get get very far with getting the civilian departments putting their officials in for longer courses. Is that too defeatist? Is there not some way we can change the system so that becomes more possible?
Well, I mean, I don't mean to be defeatist, and maybe the next generation or the current generation of leaders in Whitehall will be better than our generation was. But I do think there is something in the structural point that the armed forces, given their size, but also given their core task, which is to be prepared and ready and trained and exercised for unpredictable eventualities, means that for them, a year at the Command Staff College at Shrivenham, a year at the Royal College of Defence Studies, is seen as a core part of their career progression. Whereas I think there's a risk that in the kind of civilian Whitehall departments that are deep in crisis management all the time, someone who goes out and spends a year at Shrivenham comes back, people may think, well, you've had a nice holiday, now you can get down to a serious job. And so there has to be a real culture change in Whitehall. And I'm just a bit pessimistic on the basis of my career's experience that will happen. I'm all for using the really excellent resources that the military have, including for strategic thinking, including for lessons learned, including for operational analysis in places like Shrivenham, to use those also for more civilians involved in their courses. I agree. I think it is getting better. I think the intelligence agencies are sending some of their best and brightest on courses like that as well, which is excellent. But the more they can be modular, the more it can be 2 weeks or a month rather than the 9 months, because then I think it will fit more into the natural career rhythm of civilian departments, which I doubt is going to change, even if people would like it to.
I think that's right. Right, okay, so L. Blanc asks, how important is it to have a diverse, ethnically diverse national security workforce to help adapt and evolve to hybrid warfare? Also, will the art of diplomacy become more important where greater empathy becomes a key quality? I mean, I suppose at the heart of that, those questions is there's quite a lot of talk about diversity of background or ethnicity, gender, sexuality, whatever it might be, creates a diversity of thought. In your experience, does that link hold? Does diversity of background mean more diversity of thought and therefore a greater quality of decision making?
Yes, it does, absolutely. And I think greater diversity of all kinds, ethnic diversity, certainly, gender diversity, absolutely, but also diversity of background in ways of thinking, more scientists, more data specialists, more people who think in unusual ways, is good for the civil service, absolutely. I mean, I do think a group like the civil service is always at risk of groupthink. And unless it looks like and thinks like the society it represents, then it's not going to do a good job. By the way, I think the intelligence agencies and the security service in particular got onto this early in the counterterrorism area, where they found that they desperately needed on their staff people who thought, came out of the same communities as some of the radicalized people they were having to deal with, and could think like that and could help them to understand the mindset of someone who might move from being devout to being radicalized to potentially even becoming a terrorist. So diversity of background, of ethnicity, absolutely is vital, and we need to do much more of that. And we need also to take the national security issues out to the wider country, because I think we're also guilty of dealing with national security in the Westminster Whitehall commentariat bubble, and not treating them as issues that are actually crucially important to the lives of everyone in the country, and discussing them more widely and making them more accessible. And again, the more diverse our staff dealing with national security, the more likely it is we can make these issues rapidly understandable to everyone around the country.
Very good. So Paul O'Neill from RUSI asks, he says, the biggest learning people get is through experience, and academy cannot match that. So investing in mentoring and coaching and in peer-to-peer networks can provide perhaps more powerful learning approaches. So are we, I mean, in a sense, the question is maybe we're thinking too much of an academy or as being something a little bit too separate, something that takes people out of their jobs for a little period of time. And there's more we can do in terms of investing in supporting people in their jobs and building what he calls peer-to-peer networks. So workplace training, I guess, rather than separate training. I mean, is this a false distinction?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the two aren't mutually exclusive, are they? And I think both are absolutely essential. In my career, it was almost entirely what you call workplace training, which was in practice a young diplomat would arrive sitting in what we used to call the third room, the workhorse room of the Foreign Office, and then the rather more experienced person across the desk would put their feet on the desk at coffee time and would talk about how to do the job, the history, anecdotes, examples, before picking up your effort at a piece of drafting and correcting it and showing you how it needed to be if it was going to make an impact. I mean, I would not underestimate that at all. I've been having the time for more senior staff to help more junior staff day by day on the desk get better at the job is crucially important. But I think in my generation, the more systematic learning of wider skills, of skills you perhaps weren't practicing yourself, of exposure to other departments, other issues, encouragement to think strategically, a bit of history. I mean, we didn't have any of that. I think all of that is important. I think to get well-rounded professionals who can adapt quickly to a sudden crisis like a pandemic, the more you can combine regular systematic workplace learning with some more deep dives, and especially broadening out those horizons, as we've been saying early on in people's careers, so they feel comfortable lifting the phone and talking to somebody in an intelligence agency. I mean, I wouldn't have known how to begin to do that for the first 10 years of my career. I wouldn't even have known if they had phones in intelligence agencies. So I think getting people comfortable with working with each other is something that you can do through more systematic academy-style learning.
There's an argument which I certainly hear in defence, but also in the foreign office community, that you really need some people in the organisation who know a particular place or a particular theme very well and have a specialist career. So you have a specialist as an expert on Russia or China or the Middle East or whatever, and they spend relatively little of their time elsewhere. And perhaps they spend, they may have different aspects of China, for example, but there may be things they miss out. And similarly, in the military, there may be people who have a specialist career on procurement, so they can really try to help avoid the problem we're having with Ajax now, for example. But how far do you think that pressure for people to know enough about a subject to be absolutely the best and therefore spend quite a lot of their career on it, how far is there a tension between that and perhaps the more generalist model that suggests you need to be able to understand a wide range of things, a wide range of stakeholders and so on? I mean, clearly there may be a different midpoint between those two extremes for different individuals, but how do you ensure that a focus on a more holistic approach from your officials isn't at the expense of the necessary specialist skills, which arguably we need more than ever?
I mean, I think that the obvious answer is that any organization requires a blend of those two types of skills. In some departments, there will be deep technical knowledge necessary if you're going to design and particularly deliver good policy. In the Foreign Office, a lot of it, yes, is geographical expertise. We certainly don't want a Foreign Office full of generalists without deep subject experts on China, for example, or on Russia, or in the Middle East, with the language, the culture, and the background in how those societies work. The Foreign Office was criticized, probably rightly, that we ran down our Russia expertise in the decade after the end of the Cold War. I think the same is probably true in the agencies as well. And then suddenly found that Russia was coming back as a real threat as Putin toughened his policy. China, we had a deep expertise on China as a result of Hong Kong for generations of Foreign Office sinologists. That again probably began to lapse when Hong Kong was handed back, and until suddenly we found that China had become a systematic adversary and we needed to build that back again. So equally, you can't run a foreign ministry on the basis of people who are only very, very detailed but rather narrow specialists in one country or region of the world. And therefore, you do need generalists as well who can knit things together. I mean, the generalist, I think I would put more into what I would describe as national security skills. In other words, the person who can take different cultures, different approaches and knit them together into a coherent policy that meets all the requirements. And you certainly need some people like that as well. But across all the departments, there will be the need for more people who know about cyber technology, the application of science to policy making, data, analytics. All of those skills are essential. But I would put in a plea for maintaining a generalist cadre as well of people who can put all that together into a coherent whole. I know professionalism is absolutely the watchword at the moment, but the pendulum should never be allowed to swing too far in one direction or the other. There is a happy middle between the two, I think, in all departments.
I'm sure that must be absolutely right. Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. So there's a question here from JS in relation to bringing private sector personnel into government, presumably in mid-career, so it may be a good idea, but are there obstacles to doing so in terms of the qualifications or training courses that are required? Should we be more flexible in terms of the criteria for bringing people in from the private sector?
We've been trying for decades, Malcolm. I think there's nothing new under the sun. And going back certainly to when I was a PermSec a decade or more ago, we were really, all of us across Whitehall, trying to bring in more people from the private sector, recognizing that the private sector has great skills that we can all learn from, and that it's not always the best solution to bring in contractors on a particular issue, that it can be very helpful to have private sector people in mainstream civil service jobs. I mean, there are obstacles. One, of course, is salary. That good people in the private sector will expect to make much more than a civil servant does. Another is career progression for them. If you're upwardly mobile in the private sector, you may not see 3 years in the civil service as the best route to the top. So aligning incentives, I think, is important. There are also cultural problems. That applies particularly, I think, when private sector people are brought in to be ministers. I've had a number of experiences, I'm sure others have. In some cases, private sector go-getters come in and the first thing they say is, right, well, we'll sack all this lot, they're no good, I'll bring in my own people. And they have to be told, doesn't quite work like that in the civil service, Minister. So there are some cultural issues as well if you bring in senior people. But for all that, I mean, I think there are definitely people in the private sector who would like to do some public service, to see what it's like in the public sector, and to have a public-spirited approach to trying to help solve the enormous problems the government faces. And so we need to do all that we can to overcome those obstacles and make it work. And equally, be good at, as I was saying earlier, making it good for people's careers in the public service to get some experience in the private sector as well. I think both are important.
Right, I think we're just about at the end of our allotted time, Peter, but I mean, thank you so much for that. I mean, I've learned a lot to digest there. I'm sure our audience has. Is there anything more you'd like to add?
No, well, I think we've covered the ground very well. Perhaps as a closing thought, I would say, I am quite sure that this national security approach is the right one. Perhaps I would say that anyway. But I am sure when I look back before the creation of the National Security Council, Whitehall was really struggling to do the sort of integration and fusion that we've been talking about today, and that Michael Gove started our day by saying it was so important. And I think that sense of a community led by a community of ministers who have to meet in the National Security Council regularly, systematically, to use it as a problem-solving, decision-taking forum is vitally important. The day that people understand the National Security Council is just decorative and that the real decisions are taken in the Prime Minister's study before or after a meeting, then it will lose its vitality. It needs to be a place where people are challenged, where advice is examined, contested, verified, and then decisions are taken. And if prime ministers use the National Security Council for that, then they'll find that their senior ministers pay attention to it, and it can be used to drive a sort of synergy between policy strands that I think is so crucial and has actually got even more crucial as we come out of this pandemic. So I put in that plug for using the tool that we have in the National Security Council, not keeping the tool in the shed where it's of little use. And with that, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to talk and discuss these issues. And thank you for the questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Peter. Lord Ricketts, we're delighted to have your contribution. And as always, I think a lot of agreement with what you're saying, very much in line with what the government has set out in the integrated review. The question now will be about delivering on that in practice, and we'll look forward to how that goes over the coming months and years. Thank you all very much indeed. We now have our next speaker. I'm afraid we're unable to have a round of applause for Peter. But our next speaker, going straight on, is Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, who is now Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London, and again, one of our most thoughtful commentators on national security, and I think of the same generation as Peter Ricketts in terms of having seen these various different phases of our national history and seen many of these debates come and go. But it will be interesting to see whether, like Peter, he feels there has been a direction of travel and a positive direction of travel or not. But in contrast to Peter, Laurie, of course, has spent, I think, his entire career outside government, an astute observer of the British government throughout, but nevertheless never been an insider, which I think gives him a rather privileged position in many regards, which means he's a great compliment to Lord Ricketts. So, Laurie, why don't you start by giving your observations for where we've got to so far in the discussion today, and then we can turn over to Q&A. Can I just tell people that we've now scrubbed all the old questions you had for Peter Ricketts. So if you do wish to ask a question which you don't feel was answered by previous speakers, then do please feel free to put those in the Q&A, and I'll pass them on to Professor Freedman. Laurie, over to you.
Malcolm, thanks very much indeed. You sort of asked whether there's been a sort of a natural progression. While Pamela was talking, my mind went back to the old Civil Service College in Sunningdale, where I used to visit quite often in the 70s and 80s and even 90s. In fact, I just checked, and this turned into the National School of Government, which was closed in March 2012. So we've sort of done it before, and I think the first place I would want to start if I was setting up something again is why did that close? Why was that not considered fit for the sort of purposes which now seem to be the ones that have been discovered again by government? It certainly, in its heyday, it was not only a nice place to visit, but had lots of short courses, gatherings of groups of people, and so on. Quite a strong faculty as well. So that's perhaps the first point. Second point, I've spent most of my career at King's, and we've been building up there. The Department of War Studies, but it now does much more than just war studies. So we've had a lot of experience in developing areas, whether it's cyber, security and development, terrorism, health even, and so on. So I have a bit of experience in how you do these sorts of things, which I'll talk about in a moment. Also, of course, I and colleagues at King's were involved with the Defence Academy from the start, and King still provides a chunk of academic staff to do the joint courses. So that's just sort of by way of introduction. Let me just start by talking a bit about the idea of teaching strategy. And obviously, I'm quite keen on this idea because I wrote a book on it. But I think one has to be a little bit cautious because there's a danger that we're sort of fetishizing strategy at the moment, because it sounds a really good thing to have and a really good thing to do. Because who wouldn't want to be a strategist rather than a tactician? It suggests you're long term, you're dealing with really important stuff, you're quite high up in the hierarchy, because after all, strategy is an executive function. In the end, it's about making the big decisions that take you one direction rather than another. But that, of course, also reminds us that it's not really an administrative function. You can have people advising on strategy and producing plans and making suggestions, but in the end, the decisions have to be taken by somebody there in the end, are the strategists. And I think it's already been mentioned, maybe one of the questions, that it seems to me strategy is something that's learned rather than taught. That it comes through experience, through seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, through realizing how you can get things done by knowing how to read an institution, to know where the real levers of power are to be found, to know how to get the money for important projects, and so on and so forth. And so I think inevitably a good strategist is actually somebody with good judgment. And judgment comes certainly from attending courses, reading books, reflecting, but also just having done things and sometimes made some pretty bad mistakes when you're doing it, and out of that you learn, and then talking to other people about how they go about their business and so on. So one can see the ways in which strategic skills can be developed, but I don't think it's a series of formulas that can be applied in all circumstances. Indeed, I'd go further. It seems to me there's an enormous danger in what I think governments fall prey to too often, which is sort of the Bain, McKinsey, Boston sort of strategic consulting, which just sort of assumes that very bright people can be parachuted into almost any organization and set it on a stunning new path that nobody had ever thought of before, just because they understand strategy. Actually, if I'm talking to some people sort of in a consultancy fighting this the other day, so actually what a lot of organizations need is not so much somebody who can explain a brilliant new financial strategy, but tell them how to design a better spreadsheet. Because without the better spreadsheet, the financial strategy will never work anyway. And that, I think, is a critical point, which again it fits in with things that people have already said, is actually good strategy, good policy depends not only on people with the big ideas, but people who know stuff, the specialists, and do stuff, who can make things happen. And so, I think one of the problems is we tend to talk about tactics as being very subordinate to mere tactics. Actually, you need good tacticians. You don't get much done unless you have people who know how to make institutions work. And I think one of the problems, if you think about a lot of policy making, even military command, is you'll be taught the contextual stuff. What are we doing in the Middle East? The importance of energy resources, the nature of alliances, but not the sort of low politics that actually get things done, who to avoid, how to make a pitch, where do you get the money from, what do you do if you don't get the money in time, and so on and so forth. You need, this is good tactics. So one of the real problems, I think, with a lot of policy making in organizations, not just in government, is the danger of a separation of planners from doers. The people who know how to get things done, often more junior, are not taken into account sufficiently by those who are developing the plans and the policies and so on, and then get surprised when things fall apart. So the real challenge, I think, in any government situation is how do you relate these two different areas of policy making, developing the planning, developing the policy, and the specialist knowledge and expertise you need to actually implement it. It's often considered to be technical and tactical and so on. And if I was looking for a system to develop, I'd really want it to get around that problem rather than just have people all at the same level in the hierarchy talking to each other and swapping their experiences. Let me make another point as well about the strategy of setting up organizations. I mean, obviously my experience is with academic organizations, but the Defence Academy both had to be academic and fit in with a civil service military ethos as well. And it's not very difficult conceptually, it's hard in practice. What you need is leadership and investment. And if you don't have either, and it goes back to the point about planners and doers, if you don't have somebody who is the champion of what you're trying to do, believes in it, can motivate people, mobilize them, then as likely as not, it will fall flat. People have got to have confidence in the leadership of their organizations, and that goes through to departments as well. But you also need investment. Just looking back over my career, one of the challenges certainly of early on was to persuade university administrators that if they allowed me to bring in one or two people in a certain area, we would get the money back because you would eventually bring in the students, the research grants, and so on. And it was a disturbingly hard concept often to be grasped. But once it was grasped, then you could grow opportunistically. And this is the other point I want to make, is that given what people have said about the fast-moving, changing nature of national security policy, it's a lot of it is being able to move in a timely fashion. And if you have to go through very cumbersome processes to ask for a bit more money, to bring in somebody who you know is really good and can drive things forward in an area, but you don't have the budget at the moment, if you don't have that flexibility, it's not going to work. Also, you build up your expertise on the basis of people who know stuff on research projects. I think most of the specialist areas at King's began with research programs and then attracted students, and that provided them with the sustainability that they would otherwise have lacked. And again, that provides the interest. So if you want people to teach this stuff in whatever institution you're trying to establish, you've got to make it intellectually interesting for them. If it's not intellectually interesting, they won't come. This was the big issue that I think the most impressive thing about the Defence Academy is that it was grasped when we set up the Defence Studies Department there, that if you want exciting, able people to teach, then they've got to be able to feel that they're on top of their field. And you want the people who are being taught by them to feel that they're on top of their field. Now, you may feel that this is not what you're trying to do with whatever the new setup is going to be. And I think that's fine. You're talking about convening, networking, bringing people together. That's all well and good. It still needs structures, but it's not the it's not a full-blooded college. But to the extent you need faculty, they have to be clued in. Otherwise, they have no credibility. the final point I'd make is, this is not to the sort of skills agenda and so on. You need people. There are skills, there are competences that you want people to develop. People all say critical thinking is very important, which of course it is. Critical thinking can be bloody awkward at times. That's the whole point of it. You need to create situations in which people can say difficult, possibly embarrassing and awkward things. And if they can't do that, then again, the zip will be lost from the experience, and people will just, the danger with all courses and so on is they're box ticking. I've done 5 courses on A, B, and C. Please, can I be promoted? If you want this to be really developing an interesting network, people know who to go to, can strike up good conversations, can work together effectively, understand each other's language, and so on. Then it requires a degree of trust, but it also requires a readiness to speak out and not feel that as soon as you, obviously there are certain things these days you should never say, but there are plenty of things which are just merely critical, that must never appear to be career threatening when you say them. So I think that there's a culture to this as well as a structure. I think at that point, Malcolm, I'll stop and we can have a conversation.
And I've made the classic mistake there. So, I have some questions of my own. Let me just remind people in the audience, if you do wish to ask a question, do please put it in the Q&A box, and I'll relay that to Professor Freedman. But maybe I could start with that last point, because it really relates, of course, to the review of the experiences with the Iraq War, and you were, of course, on the commission dealing with that, and that was very much focused on whether there was enough critical thinking at that moment in government and too much groupthink. And I'd be interested in your observations as to whether the government today, and particularly the civil service side rather than the political side, has learnt the lessons of that period, or not, all the lessons which you and the other members of the commission put forward.
It's a good question. The answer is I don't know. It's hard. All one can do is observe how different policy areas are addressed. I think you can certainly see with the pandemic, which is an incredibly difficult issue to get your heads around. I think though SAGE is criticised correctly in some ways for some of its initial judgments, you did have a sort of a dynamic, challenging source of policy there. And I think that there was a degree of groupthink even within SAGE to start with. But because they are evidence-based people, the evidence was able to challenge it. So, and I think, again, if you look back at some of the failures, it was the failure to gather evidence as much as the conclusions that were drawn from it that made a difference. And that's relevant to one of the other criticisms that Chilcott made, which was, I think we put sort of the lack of ground truth. When people are in difficult situations, there's a tendency not to say we're not coping, we're struggling here. Most you might say we're in a spotted bother, but actually, as this information gets filtered upwards till it reaches the top, a really dire situation gets presented as being really quite okay, and everything's under control. And I think this again is the importance of the links between those the specialists, those doing stuff, and those who are making policy. If you don't actually get the good information, good advice, honest, critical advice, then you're going to struggle in that regard. So I think when we, sometimes the problem with the talk about groupthink is sometimes the groupthink is right. I mean, the consensus opinion happens to be the right one. And you can argue that, say, the vaccine people came to a collective view that was right. Let's challenge it, criticize it. But I think that, so I think what has to be careful. Just a final point. I'm rambling a bit here. Final point. Now, one of the things that came out of Chilcot was the challenge. That it was important for people to be able to challenge, and so they should be. But of course, you've always got somebody in any organisation who feels marginalised, misunderstood, and very grumpy, who will keep on challenging when they should really shut up. And I think the further problem is if you're junior, however hard you're told you should challenge, it's still seen as a career risk. So I think the real need is for people at the top to invite the criticism, to invite the challenge. Just saying you've got a right to put your hand up and say, I think you're victims of groupthink isn't good enough.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and a really important part of this national security skills conversation. I mean, you were quite critical of the idea that strategy can be taught, and your remarks about fetishizing strategy and so on were pretty hard hitting. Would you apply the same criticism to teaching leadership? Because certainly the armed forces will talk, and Peter Ricketts talked a little bit about this in relation to all the resource the armed forces put into teaching leadership, which of course is not only about strategy, it's also about delivery.
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, I'm all in favour of studying strategy and thinking about strategy, having courses on strategy. I'd lose quite a bit of income if people stopped doing that. But what I'm nervous about is a formulaic approach. These are things and there are plenty of books on the market that people will know about. These are the things that turn you into a great strategist. And often they come under the heading of sort of leadership lessons from Julius Caesar, or leadership lessons from Attila the Hun. There is one on that. You can get leadership lessons from any successful person. So, I think my view on this has always been that good strategy, good leadership depends on very situational dependent. A very quiet person can be a very effective leader in some circumstances, but will be terrible in others. So it's something that people need to reflect on and think about. I don't think if you're putting people into leadership positions, then you want them to be able to discuss, think about what this requires. There are certain things you're always going to need to be able to do. There are certain skills you need, budgets. Always one that gets neglected until you have to do it. So I think there's plenty to discuss about leadership and to study about leadership. But again, I think it's the formulaic approach that worries me. And strategy certainly is a very important part of leadership. And that's a lot of what you're doing. And it's not just the ability to work out a strategy, it's the ability to communicate it and to explain what you're doing and why. But, I was in leadership positions, and what I did suited the organization of which I was a part and my personality. So other things that people might think essential, I just wasn't very good at. But I did what I thought I was good at. So the point is, these are quite broad concepts, and you can learn from other people. You can watch what other people do, but essentially, you're developing problem-solving skills and the ability to bring people along with you. and sometimes you can do that just by shouting at them and telling them to obey orders. A lot of the time, you've got to be very persuasive. It depends.
Very good. So, Leanne Saunders from FCDO, who of course has worked on these issues intensively, has a comment really, but you may wish to respond, Laurie. And Leanne says, on the issue of groupthink, while we have a long way to go, our national security community did learn lessons from Chilcot. The NSC official shadow board is a good example of getting a different group of people from closer to the coalface, able to challenge senior decision makers. And the Chilcot checklist helps those working on NSC papers and areas of policy surfaces assumptions and enable challenges. So maybe for the benefit of one audience, a little bit more about the Chilcot checklist, since not everybody may be aware of what that is.
I'm not sure I can remember it. Look, basically, an MOD produced a pretty good booklet as well.
Yeah.
They're just things you need to think about and to be sure about. Unintended consequences, legal issues. So it's all the stuff that people would think would push to one side. If you look at what happened with Iraq, far too many problems that people raised were not addressed in a timely fashion. It's not that they didn't know about the next stages, where this was all leading, what your goals were, unintended consequences, and so on. But they assumed that let's get through this stage and then we can worry about those things. So I think that was there. And the red teaming, which was done a bit before Iraq, is also another way of keeping the challenges going. I think, but also, Iraq is a very powerful cultural memory now in the policy-making community. It was a pretty traumatic experience. So I think so long as people say, yes, but isn't that what happened with Iraq? You've got a chance of people questioning. It's when they get confident again. It's like with financial crises. People who've been through 2007, 8 and so on are a bit scarred by that and will look very carefully at what's on their balance sheets. But after a time, they say, well, we learned from that. We're not going to make those mistakes again and get confident and cocky. So you constantly need to, the sort of, are you sure questions, and small voice whispering in the ear, or those things are always going to be necessary. But having been through some big shocks to our system in recent years, I suspect there's less confidence in initial policy judgments than there might have been 20 years ago.
I think that makes a lot of sense. There may be another issue that even as the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan are still quite recent for senior policymakers, the lessons of the Cold War are ones which none of our existing policymakers were in anything but the most junior role in the last years of the Cold War, and therefore maybe it will be too easy to learn the wrong lessons from the Cold War, particularly since the Cold War was seen as a success in the end by ourselves. So is there a danger maybe we didn't have a Chilcot inquiry into the Cold War because it turned out well?
Yes, it's hard to have inquiries into things where you think you succeeded. I think the danger, the trouble is the Cold War is now seen as sort of a homogenous period that lasted from the late 40s to 1990 or something. And we're both old enough to know it went through many stages and didn't, we were aware of the shifts and turns at the time, and there were some big mistakes made in policy and judgment. So I think you find at the moment the comparison, say, with are we setting up a Cold War II with China, and when I think it's quite a different situation for all sorts of reasons. But when you start saying, well, what are the reasons it's different? Then, and for example, China's role in the international economic system versus the Soviet Union's, the role of the maritime versus the continental, or whatever. There's all sorts of reasons for us to look at it differently. But it requires you then to do a bit of history. And, it's always the case that I think people who read a lot of history, I would say this, wouldn't I, are going to understand that the policy questions that were faced in the past, which were really very often very difficult, obviously with a big nuclear overhang over many of them, how they were handled, why they came out the way they did. And I think, again, the more you look at the history of policy making, rather than just learn about the highlights of the Berlin and Cuba and so on, the more you realize the importance of political skills, the importance of tactics, why quite small choices often made an enormous amount of difference. That's the sort of thing I think that does come with experience. But history is vicarious experience, so you can just try and learn a bit from other people's mistakes.
No, very, very useful. Right, we have a question from Madeline Moon, which is about the role of Parliament, which I think is a really interesting question. And she says, government departments and ministers are scrutinised by select committees, but they often resent and ignore their reports. Is there a need, Madeline speaks with feeling, having sat on those committees for quite a number of years. So she asks, is there a need for select committees to give greater focus to following through on reports to ensure lessons of failure and mistakes are learned? And although she doesn't ask this, I would ask, does Parliament have enough authority or power to really follow through and report? Certainly, my observation would be often select committees' greatest power is the power to expose governments and to bring issues into the public domain and to interrogate people in Parliament, as we saw with Dominic Cummings a few days ago. But they've got much less ability to actually burrow into the detail of what government's doing, because their access to information is often quite limited. So but the role of select committees has been transformed over the last couple of decades, I think, much to the better. But I wonder whether there's more we can do in this space to encourage that diversity of thinking that we've been talking about.
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I was an advisor to the Defence Select Committee when it was set up in 1980. I worked on a number of reports, mainly on nuclear issues, but not just on nuclear. And I was really impressed. I mean, I was impressed by the attitude of the members of Parliament, the amount of stuff you get through. And while, for example, while people are talking about the new inquiry that will be needed on COVID, the Health Select Committee, Technology, Science and Technology have done excellent stuff. I mean, a lot of the time, all the hard questions that need to be asked, people are going to discover they've already been asked by parliamentary committees. Yet the only time anybody noticed was when there was a misleading headlines, at least, on Test and Trace, which people still spout back to you, which was just wrong about how the money was spent and so on and so forth. So I think it's one of the problems of select committee reports is they're not hard for governments to ignore if they don't like them. And they tend to be quite comprehensive, and we try to be comprehensive, so that they'll end up with 50 points and recommendations. Actually, if they ended up with 3 points and 1 recommendation, they're probably going to get more notice. So I think there's a real problem just in the way the media handles these things, because anybody who looks at parliamentary reports, so there's a lot of detail, a lot of information in them, Often very interesting stuff. If you dig in them, you'll find out a lot. But that's not how the media operates. They're looking for the headline. They're looking for the way to embarrass government. So that I think would. So I think there's much more that could be done. And I think certainly if you're talking about a learning process or a more institutionalized process within organised by the Cabinet Office or whatever, they should bring the select committees much more into it. I think it would be because there is a lot of expertise there. There was always one example that always struck me when we got to the Falklands was the suggestion that wouldn't it have been a good idea if at some point during the 70s a select committee of some sort had really looked at the question of the future of the Falkland Islands, because it was a minority interest, and you may have come up to this challenge, where we ended up, but the fact is, in 1981 we had a policy that was not to negotiate with Argentina seriously, but not to do anything to help the islands prosper and look after their own security. So we ended with the worst of both policies. Now, Phil, if that had been used more, you might have been able to explore an area of policy that wasn't a majority interest, but nonetheless, as we saw in '82, could bite us and almost end in embarrassment and humiliation.
That's a very good example, and parliamentary committees should be looking for the next disaster.
Well, if they'd looked at the COVID, so if there'd been a proper look at pandemic resilience in 2019, it would be interesting to see what they would have made of it.
Indeed. Very good. Now, I'm not sure if this is a question for you, Laurie, so say if it's not, but JS asks, he or she agrees very much with a comment regarding critical thinking and suggests that groupthink is sometimes driven by careerism, and then asks, how much do you think bringing vetting within the Cabinet Office, i.e. under ministerial control, is likely to discourage critical thinking in senior civil servants? So very interesting role. Is vetting something which can be, I guess, misused to discourage critical thinking?
Well, there's vetting and vetting, isn't there? There's the "Are you vulnerable to blackmail? Are you a traitor?" sort of vetting,
yeah.
And then are you sound? Are you going to be eccentric and disruptive? And we now know there's forever going to be a question in the Cabinet Office if certain people who might well be not at all vulnerable to blackmail and not at all treacherous, but are sort of disruptive by nature, are offered, whether they would wish to take them. So I think again it comes. It's a cultural point. Anybody who's run an organisation knows that most organisations have a limited tolerance for disruption, for real disruption. It's great to have somebody challenging and being awkward and so on, but after a point, you've got to get stuff done. There are other issues to address. There's other things bearing in on you. On the other hand, if you don't have that at all, then you're going to get complacent and woolly thinking and so on. So I think within government, it's a real problem. And I think it's a problem that's got worse because it only takes a leak to a newspaper of some WhatsApp or email or whatever that somebody has sent that doesn't put things as carefully as they should. And you've got a cold crisis and people have got to disavow things they said, and the government's on the back foot and they've got a defensive briefing and all these sorts of things. And whereas in the past, there's probably a much high degree of tolerance of sort of eccentric thought, shall we say, or just, you know, the awkward specialists who've been around for years, who knew lots and lots and might bore away on the topic, but at least you could rely on them. I think the more streamlined government has become, the more generalist it's become. I think the sources of challenge and the more dangerous challenge becomes once it's exposed to public view, before government has taken its own view on whether this is a good or a bad challenge, the harder it becomes to get that critical debate. And to, you know, to use the language of the moment, you know, civil servants probably need safe spaces as well, where they can just talk honestly and candidly about some of the issues they face, even the personalities they face, without being worried that they're going to be appear in the Daily Mail the next day. So I think these are, I think, you know, we always come back to this phrase, it's a balance, and it is. But, you know, part of good policy making and strategy making, whatever, as I said in my introduction, is to understand the importance of personality and character and tactics and detail and chance and uncertainty, rather than just believe that everything is handled by, you know, some sort of setting out some master plan that's identified every problem and sequential step ahead so it can be easily followed. I think, you know, good policy making does depend very much on skills that are hard to teach, and a lot of it is about how you deal with those characters who are awkward, are disruptive, who may not pass something we warn you against, but actually can be invaluable in making you see a problem in a different light, or realizing a pitfall ahead.
No, very good. So there's a couple of questions which I think are related, but they're not the same. But maybe it would be useful to see what you think about both of them. The first question is from Clive Four, who asks you to comment on the importance of systems thinking in government and its apparent absence as part of the government's organizational culture. And then Dimitrios Mathiotakis asks about the boundaries between strategy planning and policy implementation. How can we limit the distance between planning and execution in the security environment? And how far can IT applications help to narrow that distance? So two quite complex questions, I think, but any help you can give on either would be much appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, everybody likes the idea of systems thinking and holistic views and so on, because who wouldn't? I mean, it sounds much more sensible than sort of narrow silo-based thinking and so on. But actually, you know, we think in manageable chunks, and so there are some definitions of strategy which require you to take in so much of your environment, relate so many disparate things to each other, that you know, your mind will just blow at the end of it. You can't cope. So, and that's why specialists are important. I mean, you have to accept people, and why, you know, the job of the senior people is often to bring together different specialisms and encourage them to coordinate and so on. And that becomes easier, again, going back to the sort of thing that the Cabinet Office may want to encourage, the more that the networks are allowed to develop. Again, it's not just a question of thinking. It's about personalities and cultures and getting to know each other and so on. So you need holistic approaches. You need a sense of how the system fits together. but that can go too far because you end up defining a problem that's totally insoluble in the end, or else you assume too much interdependency. And sometimes things can be dealt with in its silo, doesn't it? You can just get on sorting a small problem. Now, the second question is to some extent, a large part of what I was arguing is the biggest danger, I think, in government is when gaps develop between the development of policy and its execution. The formation of agencies and so on, I don't think helped with all of this. The military, I think, now through experience, have learned that though the mantra is that the politicians give you the objectives and they work out the operations necessary to achieve these objectives. Yeah. There's no point about having a discussion of objectives unless you know whether they're feasible or not. And this requires a close interaction between the National Security Council could do between the policymakers and the senior military figures. That's not quite junior military figures. So unless you have, that seems to be how it should be. Far too often, you have, and this is not just talking about the national security side of government, policies being developed without any real sense of how they're going to be implemented or what are going to be the unintended consequences of them being implemented, the knock-on effects and so on. It is the biggest causes of failure in government, I would say, lie in that area. And that's why I stress the importance of bringing the specialists and the tacticians and the executors into the policy-making process, just to test them, just to ask the question. And it's not just, you don't want just the can-do stuff. You really need to think. Anybody who's looked at quite different areas, say, of the benefit system and so on, can see all sorts of ways in which ill-thought-out policies have had very adverse consequences and not produced the outcomes that you want. Now, can IT make a difference? I think good evidence gathering is critical, and now in the areas that you and I dealt with, evidence gathering may not always be that simple. If you're talking about mounting a military expedition into a particular country, then you need the area specialists, people who know the language, people who can tell you that's not going to go down very well, or if you must do this, these are the people you need to talk to and ignore them and so on. That's a very specific sort of specialist. But in many areas of wider policy, as we've seen with the pandemic, gathering good evidence and keeping it up to date is essential. But then you get to questions of interpretation of this evidence and who does the interpretation. And again, as all of us have become amateur epidemiologists over the last 18 months, we're becoming aware that some measures are better than others. You actually need to understand statistics because elementary areas of statistical misunderstanding have caused enormous confusion about 10% of what, for example. You know these issues well, Martin, as a good economist, but a lot of people don't. And so one of the things that worries me about AI is that we can get enormous help in some of this. I think it's wrong to dismiss it as being just the systems taking us over. But there is a risk of policymakers being presented with options they don't understand. They don't really know where they've come from, or presented with a sophistication that they don't have the, let's say, statistical capacity, knowledge to understand. And something that sounds really bad actually isn't so bad at all, or really good actually isn't so good at all. So I think we ought to be better at gathering information, because obviously people get very nervous about the information that's collected upon them. We've got to deal with all of that issue as well. But how you understand the analysis and interpretation is critical. I think there's all sorts of possibilities with AI which are wholly helpful, and we should dismiss them. But as with all these things, there's a downside as well. But unless there is some basic understanding of what numbers mean, then we're going to see a lot of the, I mean, not just bad policy, but just poor public debate. We haven't really talked about that, but good policy is helped by good public debate. We've mentioned select committees. Parliament has already been mentioned more broadly. We know the problems with the media, but unless you get good public debate on these issues, then it tends to becomes easier to get away with bad policy, or governments find it difficult to explain good policy.
Well, I would entirely endorse the importance of quantitative skills. If your strategy is about priorities, and priorities in the end usually come down to numbers. They come down to numbers in relation to money or people or other resources. And quantitative skills can be learned. And maybe there's sometimes too lazy. There are two cultures we still have here. The number of rather senior people who say they just don't do numbers always astounds me as an economist, as you're saying, Laurie. But I just don't get how you can make these judgments without really having a grasp for numbers. So that's absolutely right. L. Blanc in the Q&A really reinforces what you just said, but he or she summarizes it as: don't shoot the strategist, question the objective. So I think that's very much what you're saying. I think that's right. Maybe a couple of more questions and then we'll have to finish. And one is that this is maybe partly observations in the chat, but you may want to comment on it. Sevi asks, Minister's Office for Devil's Advocate, anyone? Question mark. And I thought we had that in Dominic Cummings, but perhaps not. But is there another way, apart from, in addition to the things you've been talking about, to have that devil's advocate somewhere in? I mean, Leanne talked earlier, I think, very usefully about shadow teams of officials, and perhaps at a more junior level. But are there anything else we could do within government to institutionalize to some extent the person that tells the king that they're fallible, which should be a classic role of an official, but maybe is there more we can do in that regard?
I think that's a role potentially outsiders can play as well. You need to be able to bring in outsiders occasionally. Trust them, say, what do you think of this, or we're thinking of doing that. I mean, one of the things that Thatcher did, I don't think has been done as much since, was have seminars. I mean, if anybody thinks about Thatcher, she actually would gather outsiders around the table. Some of these seminars became quite famous, notably the one on Germany. But I went to a couple, and they're really very interesting. And challenging, and she did her homework. But and this is, I think, slightly different from just having the sort of trusted soul who's, again, sound and isn't going to make waves, is actually realizing the divergence between experts. And again, that's one of the things we've learned. It's about taking the best scientific advice, but we know that scientists differ. With good reason, because these are difficult issues. It's not always a simple right answer. And sometimes it's good for governments to know that actually these differences exist, and that helps them understand the sort of judgments that they're having make. It may encourage them to be a bit bolder, because the scientists are not going to help them out in the end. They're just going to have to make the judgment. So I think outsiders can play an important role in a variety of settings. And I don't think this is just a case of having somebody you trust. You've got to trust them not to be indiscreet, but it's good to have challenge even within that community. I think when people are playing devil's advocate, they're often not being very devilish. I mean, it's often, really quite an innocuous challenge. You always expect something more to follow that. You just. I remember when I started at Chatham House, there were all these sort of great and good former Foreign Office types, whose idea of being a devil's advocate or being indiscreet was a sort of a mild diversion from the orthodoxy. Well, you people have got no idea about what's being said out there. Just what the real advocates what the real critics say. And unless you hear what the real, what the real critics are saying, then you may think you've been very bold, but actually, to a lot of outsiders, you're just stuck in the same tram line. But that's again just another argument for being part of the public debate, being aware of what's being said outside, bringing outsiders in, getting outside yourself, encouraging. Odd thought to end with, but rather than somebody going to a specialist course for civil servants, maybe if they just attended a public meeting in Tower Hamlets or something, they might learn a bit more.
Well, that's a great way to end. I have one last question from Suzanne Rain, who's going to be chairing the next panel. But Suzanne asks, does this not argue yet again for a proper investment in government assessment and analysis?
I think it does. I mean, again, it's all about my advanced years, but I mean, there used to be so much more of that, actually. I mean, you'll remember West Byfleet and the Defence Operational Analysis Establishment, which, the military never forgave them for the 1981 Defence Review. There used to be all sorts of characters around Whitehall who'd been around forever and really knew their stuff. It was a bit chaotic. I don't think it was well organised. But these people were there. And I think that, it's an important evaluation. I mean, in most businesses, charities, whatever, evaluation has become really very important. And it's one way to feed back from the effects of a policy to make changes, to see if it's working. And government is scared of evaluation in some ways because on the big policies, because it'll pinpoint things they did wrong.
Yeah.
But you've got to, if these things are just accepted as a matter of course, then the sting can be taken out of them. So I agree very much that it's an area where, we do have the NAO and so on, but I think these organisations need more strength, more bite, and again, it's an area where you can work with Parliament as well, so that criticism and evaluation, including things that have been done well, just become a matter of course. I mean, if it's known that somebody's going to say you did a really good job here, it might make people more ready to submit themselves. And it would be nice. The only area where I can remember for a long time people saying, "Oh gosh, didn't we do well?" was the vaccine program. So again, I think that there's a history of criticism leading to media stories, leading to trouble, that puts people off evaluation, whereas in practice it's essential.
Yeah, no, very, very thoughtful. So we've come to the end of this session. Laurie, you and Peter Ricketts, I think, have both provided complementary but both fascinating perspectives. And I've been struck in both cases, quite historical perspectives. You've been able to put the current discussion about next steps in that wider context. And I don't think either of you has said, well, it's all been tried before, but you have said you need to look at what's been tried before and learn from the lessons of the past if you're to move forward. And that's been very helpful. And I think we've had quite a diversity of views from the questioners, a number of practitioners, as well as ex-practitioners getting involved in our discussion. And I think we've set ourselves up very well for this afternoon.